Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, February 1st, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the DNC holding their chair elections this weekend at the Gaylord National Hotel, announcing that Ken Martin, the chair of the Minnesota DFL, aka the Minnesota Democratic Party, will now be the chair for the next 4 years or potentially longer in this upcoming second Trump term. Now, we've been talking about the past week about the DNC elections in the wake of a second Trump era, what it means to have new Democratic leadership now that Jamie Harrison, the outgoing DNC chair, at his point when he decided that he was not running for re-election. The Democratic Party at large has been looking for people to lead them through this realignment period. In the aftermath of the 2024 presidential election, where do they go from here? Biden world is now in a position where President Biden and those closest to him no longer hold the same type of Democratic political power that they used to, and with Vice President Kamala Harris no longer as the Democratic Party nominee, a lot of things were up in the air. But in a decisive victory, Ken Martin won, completely going against many of the different things we had seen from people such as Nancy Pelosi and Hakeem Jeffries, major Democrats that made major endorsements in this race for Ben Wickler, the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, and Ken Martin, who had been serving for 14 years as the chairman of the Minnesota Democratic Party, ultimately came up with 55% of the vote in what was nearly a 2-to-1 victory over Ben Wickler, who received 30% of the vote, and Martin O'Malley, the former governor of Maryland, who received 10% of the vote. And what we have seen here now with Ken Martin is a new setting of the stage for the Democratic Party, at least when it comes down to who they are, how they are approaching this second Trump term. And what I mean by that is, this is the first time since 2011 that the Democratic Party will be led by somebody who is not a woman or a person of color. And so many Democrats have been questioning, is this something that matters at the national leadership? Is it something that doesn't? Ultimately, though, it is a point to mention. On top of that, too, now, Ken Martin made it very clear in his campaign and in his overall acceptance speech and all of these different, messaging points. Immediately, we're starting to see the shift amongst the National Democratic Party here, that they are focusing quite heavily on taking the gloves off. And so what that means for Ken Martin is calling things out as they are, going through a new style of Democratic messaging, focusing more on different, pushbacks against Donald Trump, making this party also bigger in the scale that he has talked about here: build to win, build to expand, build to last. Scaling up the Democratic Party, working with local and state chapters, building out a DNC, and building out a national party brand that is built to last, built to win, built to expand. And so it's going to be interesting to see how Ken Martin differs in his leadership in comparison to Jamie Harrison. Kamala Harris received a thunderous applause, according to those at the Gaylord from Politico reporting on there, very much showing that amongst the party's elite, she is still very popular, still very well recognized, but she did not endorse in this election. And it is clear, too, that the rejection of what some of the mainstream party elites decided to throw their weight towards Ben Wickler in the final minutes of this DNC chairman election did not make enough of a difference to defeat Ken Martin in this race here. Ultimately now, Ken Martin will be the next DNC chair. And what I mean by that there is, when we looked at the list of endorsements and we talked about the weight of Nancy Pelosi, when we talked about the weight of Hakeem Jeffries, the weight of all of these Democrats who are national names, very well-known names, all of these different things, they did not, most of them, did not endorse Ken Martin. To be fair, he got the endorsement of Tim Walz. That's a big thing, but, Tim Walz being governor of Minnesota, Ken Martin being chair of the Minnesota Democratic Party, that was all but expected. But when you take a look at what, Ken Martin had in comparison to Ben Wickler, it shows that, again, the Democratic Party establishment was much more on the side of Ben Wickler. You had Chuck Schumer and Dick Durbin, two sides of Senate Democratic leadership, well-respected members of their party delegation, well-respected by voting members of the DNC. On top of that, too, Hakeem Jeffries, the current minority leader in the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, former Speaker of the House. We know all of these people, and they do big things in the Democratic Party and receive a lot of accolades. Democrats love many of these names that I've already mentioned, not to mention the countless other DNC members and also Democratic establishment officials that said that they were backing Ben Wickler. But the big surprise here, too, is that Ben Wickler announced that he had 183 DNC members publicly backing him in this race. That was in comparison to 137 for Martin O'Malley and roughly 200 for Ken Martin. Now, when it comes down to the actual vote tally, Martin O'Malley received far under what he had expected at 44, but arguably so did Ben Wickler, who only received 134.5. Ken Martin, on the other hand, received a decisive 246.5. Now, Wickler was also backed by members of the party elite that don't necessarily hold elected office positions. What that means is there are people like George Soros who backed Ben Wickler in this race. Other billionaires, huge fundraisers, and huge members of the party that have been funding many of these Democrats also backed Ben Wickler. He received endorsements from some notable party chairs, such as Anderson Clayton, the chair of the North Carolina Democratic Party, and a number of different labor unions and organizations, but ultimately, Ken Martin came ahead. And so it'll be interesting to see how Ken Martin navigates the first few obstacles of getting into Democratic leadership. There's going to be a lot of questions about the 2026 midterms, about the 2027 races, and the 2028 presidential, and Ken Martin is going to have to tackle all of that. And that isn't to say that he isn't up for the challenge. After all, he did run for this race and was 14 years as DFL chair in the state of Minnesota. That means something. And although Ben Wickler had what many people say was a very impressive electoral track record, he had been serving far less time than Ken Martin, on top of the fact that Ken Martin does come from a state where Democrats, when in positions of leadership, do in fact enact massive changes across the state, the likes of which that on the national level you would compare to maybe Democrats having a majority of 65 to 35 in the Senate and 300 to so in the House, when in Minnesota, these came down to just party line votes, sometimes 50 to 50, 51 to 49, and that made all the difference when Ken Martin was that Democratic Party chair who was fielding and vetting these candidates that were running in the races, backing the right people, getting involved in primaries that are needed to be involved in, right? Seeing the change of the congressional maps and the leadership for Democrats and Republicans moving from more outskirt and rural areas to more suburban and urban areas. It's something that was unique not only to Minnesota, but to many swing states that many party chairs had to tackle, and it seems, at least given the electoral track record, that Ken Martin was in fact, and is in fact, a good chair of the Minnesota Democratic Party. And like I said, Ben Wickler received a lot of accolades for keeping Wisconsin within a 1.5% shift. That cannot be ignored. And maybe there is an argument to be made that Wickler would have been a stronger DNC chair or not. That's something that, no longer matters now that the election is over. And of course, was this point of contention? Everybody's running because they think they are better than each other. But I'm not going to say here that one was going to be definitively better than the other. I will say they bring in different sets of experiences, but a largely shared vision for the future of the party, and that's expanding where they are right now, building out new majorities, building out a party that's willing to last and able to, be closer to the average person, reach people where they are, all these different things, the major talking points. They largely had the same vision for the future of America and the future of the Democratic Party, but Ken Martin will be the one leading this party. And so I, again, like I said, before this race was over, am interested to see some of their first things that they do. How does Ken Martin approach this new Democratic Party from here on out? Because he has a lot of time to work with. Now, this actually reminds me a bit of 2017, except for the fact that the establishment candidate won that race in 2017. It doesn't look like they did this time around. Now, to be fair, when Ken Martin and Ben Wickler and Martin O'Malley were the first, to enter into the race and were ultimately decided to be the top three that were going to win, the main argument here that we saw coming from members of the outside that were watching it were saying that Ken Martin was the establishment because he had known so many people. He had built up over a decades-long worth of relationships with different elected officials that he was going to reel them all in. But slowly, Ben Wickler was winning over these other members of the Democratic Party, very notable ones like Pelosi, like Jeffries, and it was starting to become Wickler becoming that more institutional and establishment style of candidate. But of course, Ken Martin, having built these relationships with so many people in the voting base, not necessarily top names, but members of the voting base. After all, there were 448 voting members of the DNC. Ken Martin was able to win not on, anything but the first ballot, which is impressive in its own right, that it didn't decide to go onto multiple ballots or require, consolidation or winning endorsements. Even all of the combined delegate count or caucus vote count combined behind Ben Wickler would not be enough to overcome Ken Martin, given that Ken Martin won 55% of the vote. And so this is where we're at. New Democratic Party being led by Ken Martin, a very interesting, set of circumstances surrounding this new Democratic Party. Donald Trump is back in office. Republicans have control of the House. Republicans have control of the Senate. It will be on this DNC, this new elected one, and the vice chair, which is set to announce potentially around the time this video goes live. It's roughly 6 p.m. Eastern time right now. And so we're still waiting to see if the vice chair elections have been held, if any other notable positions have been announced. But so far, we know who's going to be the next Democratic Party chair. And it looks like Democrats do, in fact, have a strong party chair to lead them through the next 4 years. Again, We will see how quickly these changes are made, how much is, going to be completely overhauled, how much is going to stay the same from the Biden and Harris days under Jamie Harrison. It will be a wild ride for Democrats, and they will need someone who's willing to go along with the ride with them. And I think right now that is Ken Martin, as it might have been for any of these other Democratic candidates. But ultimately, this chair election is said and done for, and the Minnesota DFL party chair has been elected, the next DNC party chair to represent Democrats on the national level. So we'll watch for the vice chair election, some of the other races that are set to take place as they finish up all of their chair elections, all of their party elections. And that'll be that. It'll be a new Democratic Party, a new set of leadership, a wide range of experiences that are very different than the ones that have been recently leading the party from 2021 onward. And we shall see if this results in better candidates, in better elections, in better results, and whether or not this will result in a party, as Ken Martin would put it, that is built to last and built to expand, because a lot of that will matter as we get into the next couple of years, next few years actually, 2028 included, in this resistance to Trump and emergence of a new, more electable Democratic Party. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 post-election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.